can enterprises reduce this implementation complexity while they deploy this, the deployment efforts and still protecting the most sensitive data? So if you can, elaborate on this as well.
So, well, part of it relies on the initial part of, say, discovering or having the right picture of all the assets that you need to protect. So if at all there is a lack of visibility, then obviously that goes into a scope where you need to perform certain data discovery activities beforehand to understand your entire landscape, to understand where the sensitive data resides, what needs to be prioritized over the other. That is the first step. Then after that, again, it comes as to how much do you fall under the specific compliances or what the compliances dictate as to what kind of protection or how sensitive data needs to be protected to meet certain compliances. So for most of these, say, compliances, you can use certain plug and play techniques. So if we talk about database encryption specifically, there are various options. The most straightforward one is tablespace encryption, which targets your database files. But imagine this, that you have an envelope, and inside this envelope, you have the files in which there is some confidential information. So if you're going to implement the tablespace level encryption, you're going to focus on putting a seal on the envelope. It's not actually making any changes to the data on these files. Okay, so when the database system gets initialized, it is basically going to get decrypted once it fetches the key, whether it is from the HSM KMS. If HSM KMS is not there, which is not an ideal scenario, then from the database instance itself, it is going to fetch the key, and it is going to say allow the users to access plain text data. Now, the challenge here is that anytime you perform any kind of operation on the database, whether it is a read-write operation or any kind of SQL query is fired, the data is present in plain text format because that has not been altered with. It is just the encryption decryption that has taken place when the system was, say, turned off or when it is initialized. So you're protecting a scenario wherein if anybody tries to take a backup of your data, that is going to remain encrypted as long as you don't have the key where you're trying to restore that data. Or another scenario is if somebody is going to physically say, if there's a scenario or any case when you want to protect from physical theft of the storage disk, then this kind of an encryption solution will protect the data in the case of theft. But when you want to protect it based on the role-based access control, so the users trying to access this data or the specific applications that are connected to the databases that should be allowed to fetch plain text data, this is where you need to focus on protecting the data on a much more granular or finer level called as column level encryption. Now, organizations mostly don't prefer this approach. Column level encryption is something which, if you don't have the native licenses, first of all, which are very expensive. So with native licenses, you can do the first approach, that is tablespace encryption as well as column level encryption. But if you don't have native licenses, if you want to do column level encryption without native licenses, then that creates a lot of challenges, because the encryption essentially what it does is that once you perform the encryption on any data, it is going to scramble the data, it is going to create a ciphertext, and depending on the algorithm, in most cases, you're not going to get the data in the same format as it was in plain text. So this encrypted value needs to be, say, consumed or be, say, stored in the databases, right? So if your database schemas or your database column types or the entire schema is not aligned with handling this encrypted value, then that is where your column level encryption essentially fails. The cost of making these changes may not be something which the enterprises or organizations want to consider in the pursuit of enforcing a much more stronger level of protection. So it is really all about, I would say, striking the right balance amongst all the other things. As I said, discovery of the data, understanding your ecosystem, understanding whether it is the right thing to do to purchase enterprise licenses or use third-party solutions, and also about how complicated it is going to be to achieve the required amount of security. Now at CryptoBind here, we have one solution which targets this specific challenge, wherein you don't need to rely on any enterprise level licenses. You don't need to rely on making changes to the database schemas, or you don't have to make any major changes in the application code to say enable the application level encryption either. What you can simply do is you can use this solution, which we call zero code encryptor, as a plug and play solution to encrypt the data. And thanks to the development of the solution and the overall engineering that has gone into making this solution, we have ensured that we utilize certain format preserving encryption techniques. We identify the data on the fly that needs to be encrypted, so you can specifically target the sensitive columns, and your data at rest and in certain scenarios, even in transit, can be protected completely. So there needs to always be the right awareness in the market about such solutions. Enterprises need to say evaluate these amongst all the other techniques as well, and that is where they can really find the perfect solution which protects the data and also reduces the implementation complexity.
That's great, Harsh. And if I'm not wrong, JISA Softech is getting a lot of inquiries on ZC innovation technologies that you have just mentioned, right?
Yes, I mean, because as I said, it solves a very fundamental challenge wherein acquiring licenses means organizations have to bear a huge cost. Enforcing the highest level of security, then in that case means again making certain changes. So in any scenario wherein there are any legacy applications or any systems which cannot be altered to a great extent to enforce column level encryption, this is exactly where our solution say sits perfectly and helps organizations align with their compliance requirements.